Judge mocks a young man in court and is left in SOC when he discovers that he is a genius lawyer in disguise. The courtroom was packed, the wooden benches creaked as people settled and whispering to each other, anxious for the outcome of this trial, but no one there knew they were about to witness something that would change everything. In the center of the courtroom, a 19-year-old black young man faced justice head on. His name is on his face. Accused of car theft and resisting arrest, he had become the center of attention, not because the case was especially complicated, but because Judge Leonard Whitmore and prosecutor David Langley were already sure how this story would end. In their minds, Issen was just another troubled kid, just another name in a pile of cases they saw every day. They didn't know the truth. Issen Carter was no ordinary teenager. He grew up studying the law, understanding every loophole, every strategy, every dirty trick that the ES used to secure a conviction, and today he was going to change the rules of the game. Judge Whitmore leaned back in his chair, watching Issen with a look of disdain. "Let's close this quickly. My time is valuable." The audience laughed. The prosecutor Langley smiled as if he had already won. Issen, however, he did not react. He was waiting for the right moment to start dismantling everything, because that court still did not know who he really was, and when they found out it would be too late. The case seemed obvious to anyone who looked at it superficially. According to the prosecution, Issen had been caught in a stolen car. He tried to flee from the police and was arrested shortly after. The evidence: fingerprints on the steering wheel, a policeman claiming he saw him driving the abandoned car a few blocks later. It seems a solid case, right? Mistake. Yen knew the case was weak, but the judge and the prosecutor were used to winning without effort. They did not even bother to review their own arguments well, and Issen was about to prove it. Langley stood up from his chair with the posture of someone who had already won. "Ladies and gentlemen, the accused was found with the stolen vehicle. His fingerprints are on the car. He tried to flee. The case could not be clearer." He turned to Issen with a smile loaded with age. "The only question left is, what does he have to say in his defense?" The court expected the young man to stutter, his public defender to make a weak speech, everything to be quick and predictable, but then Issen stood up. "I will represent myself, Your Honor." Silence fell over the room. The judge frowned. "You what?" The prosecutor lost his smile. The murmurs flooded through the court. That moment changed everything. Issen made the first move, and now he was the one in control. The silence in the court was almost deafening. Judge Leonard Whitmore adjusted his glasses, trying to understand if he had heard correctly. "He wants to represent himself," he repeated, frowning. The prosecutor David Langley let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "This is going to be fun." The audience murmured among themselves. Issen Carter, a 19-year-old, firing his lawyer to face a seasoned prosecutor. That seemed like a disaster waiting to happen, but what no one knew was that Issen was waiting for this moment. He was no ordinary kid. He spent years studying the system, and now the system was about to swallow him up. His own words. The judge sighed impatiently. "Very well, Mr. Carter, let's see what you have to say." Slowly, without rushing, he showed no fear. He didn't seem nervous. His eyes scanned the court with the coldness of someone who already knew how this would end. The prosecutor Langley closed his file and crossed his arms, waiting. Issen looked at him directly. "Prosecutor Langley, you stated that the police saw me driving the car before fleeing the scene of the crime, correct?" Langley nodded. "Board S officer reported having seen you behind the wheel before abandoning the vehicle." Yen stepped forward. "And that officer is present to testify?" Langley sketched a smug smile. "There's no need. Your testimony is documented." Yen raised his eyebrows. "Interesting." The court watched every movement. Something in Issen's voice caused an invisible discomfort. "So basically we are with Anne in a police report, but we don't have the police here to be questioned." The judge craned his neck, interested. Langley tried to hide his irritation. "The officer's report is valid." Issen smirked. "Sure, but I would like to make a formal request." He turned to the judge. He requested the car's GPS records. "Officer's patrol car at the time of the chase." Langley tensed. The judge narrowed his eyes. "What do you want to prove, Mr. Carter?" Issen placed his hands on the defense table. "I want to prove that the officer was not close enough to identify me." The court entered SOC. Langley stood still. He did not expect that. The judge looked at the prosecutor. "Does the state have any objection to the motion?" Langley took a deep breath. He couldn't outright deny. It would seem like he was hiding something, but if the record showed the officer was not in the position he claimed to be, the case would collapse. After a long silence, Langley said in a stiff tone, "No objection, Your Honor." The shock had already been made. The court was no longer laughing. The judge wrote down the motion and slammed the gavel. "The records will be requested." Langley tried to regain control of the narrative. He adjusted his tie, picked up a paper and read aloud, "Independent of that, the defendant's fingerprints were found on the steering wheel of the stolen vehicle." He looked at the jury. "Mr. Carter can argue what he wants, but the evidence speaks for itself." He smirked, but Issen didn't even blink. Instead, he took a deep breath and turned to the judge. "Can I ask the prosecutor something?" The judge gesticulated. Issen faced Langley. "Prosecutor Langley, you mentioned my fingerprints were on the steering wheel of the stolen car, correct?" "Correct." Yen paused. "Can you tell me exactly where on the steering wheel they were?" Langley narrowed his eyes. "What does that matter?" Issen smiled slightly. "Because I'm sure my fingerprints were there." The courtroom grew restless. Langley looked confused. "What?" Issen shrugged. "Yes, I touched the car, but touching something doesn't mean I stole it." The prosecutor didn't like the direction of the conversation. The fingerprints were on the steering wheel. Mr. Carter. Yen took another step. Exactly. He turned to the jury. Have you ever broken into a car that wasn't yours? Maybe a friend's car, maybe you broke in for something, or just sat in the seat out of curiosity. The court was silent. Yen continued. What the state is trying to prove is that I drove that car based solely on my fingerprints on the steering wheel. He paused. But what if I tell you I got in the car and got out? The jurors looked at each other. The prosecutor began to realize what was going on. Isin wasn't just defending himself, he was sowing doubt, and in court doubt is fatal to the prosecution. The judge looked at Langley. The state has any more evidence to prove that the defendant drove the vehicle? Langley scraped, looking the papers. The position of the fingerprints on the steering wheel is compatible with that of a driver. Yen shook his head, smiling. That is not proof, that is speculation. Langley was left without an answer. The court was beginning to realize Yen Carter was not just any defendant. He was an unlicensed attorney, and he was taking the case apart piece by piece, and the worst thing was they knew they couldn't stop him. The judge banged the gavel. The court will go into recess until the police GPS records are presented. Langley seemed visibly affected. The judge no longer looked at Isin with disdain. For the first time he looked at him with respect, but Isin knew that the fight was not over yet because the final blow was yet to come. The court was quieter than ever. The people in the audience looked at each other, trying to understand what was happening. The case that should have been an easy conviction was now falling apart before everyone's eyes, and all because Isin Carter was not the defendant they expected. Judge Leonard Whitmore ran his hand over his face, visibly uncomfortable. He knew that allowing Isin to represent himself had been a mistake that it was too late to correct now. The prosecutor David Langley flipped through his papers frantically. He needed to find something that would give the prosecution back control, but nothing seemed enough. Every argument Isin planned had already been dismantled before it was even used. And then the Ujir walked in with the policeman's GPS records. It was the moment of truth. The judge took the documents, adjusted his glasses, and began to read. The courtroom held his breath. Langley watched anxiously. Isin was calm because he already knew what the papers said. After a few seconds of absolute silence, the judge looked up. Prosecutor Langley wants to explain this. Langley swallowed hard, took the documents with shaking hands, and began to read, and then his face lost all color because the records showed that the policeman who claimed to have seen Isin behind the wheel was not even near the crime scene. He was almost 2 miles away. His entire statement was a lie. The court exploded into murmurs. The prosecution had just suffered a fatal blow. Yen let the silence work in his favor. Then he slowly stood up. It seems that the testimony of the policeman, it's worthless now. Langley tried to react. The report may contain errors, but her fingerprints were still on the car. Yen raised a hand, interrupting her from that. Now she walked to the center of the courtroom. Has Langley ever heard of the fingerprint transfer effect? Langley was silent. The judge frowned. The audience leaned forward. Isin pointed to the prosecutor. If I sit on his table now and then touch a book, can I transfer my fingerprints to the book without ever actually holding it? The jury shifted in their seats. Isin continued. If my prints were found on the car, that doesn't mean I drove it. He paused calculatedly. It just means that at some point I touched it. The prosecutor had no answers anymore. Langley knew he was lost because Isin had done much worse than prove his innocence. He made the prosecution look incompetent. The judge took a deep breath. Prosecutor Langley, is there still some evidence to prove that the defendant drove the vehicle? Langley closed his eyes. He knew the answer. He knew he lost. He swallowed hard and shook his head. No, Your Honor. And then the court realized what this meant. The case was over. Isin had won. The judge banged the gavel. The court dismisses the charges. The defendant is free to go. The courtroom exploded. Some protested, others applauded. Isin, no, he moved. Immediately he just took a deep breath and closed his eyes. For a moment he knew he had won, but he also knew that this was just the begin, because for every case like his, how many other young men were wrongfully convicted? He opened his eyes and looked around. The system wasn't broken, it was made to work this way, and now Isin knew what he had to do, because this wouldn't be the last court he would face. Next time he wouldn't be there as the defendant, he would be there as the attorney. The court was in SOC. The voices mixed in a chaotic murmur. The case had fallen apart. Isin Carter had proven his innocence, and more than that, he completely destroyed the prosecution. Judge Whitmore still held the gavel as if he didn't believe what had just happened. Prosecutor Langley, who a minute before had seemed calm and confident, now avoided eye contact with anyone in the room. The audience was divided. Some watched with admiration, others with resentment, but one thing was certain: no one would ever forget that trial. Isin remained motionless for a few seconds. He heard the noise of the reporters outside, people running to comment on what they had just witnessed, but for him everything was silent. He looked at Judge Whitmore. He still stared at him, but this time there was no contempt in his gaze. There was something different. Maybe it was respect, maybe it was surprise, or maybe it was regret. The judge took a deep breath, straightened up in his chair, and said something that took everyone by surprise. Mr. Carter, have you ever thought about studying law? The court was silent. Langley tensed. Isin smiled sideways. He didn't answer because he already knew what his destiny was outside the court. The confusion was even Greater the journalists surrounded the steps of the building, the microphones rose, the cameras flashed non-stop. Everyone wanted to know who Isin was. Carter, the 19-year-old boy who humiliated a prosecutor and challenged a judge. The questions came from all sides. Yen, how did he know what to do? He always wanted to be a lawyer. What will be his next step? But Isin ignored all that because only one person mattered to him at that moment. She was standing at the foot of the steps with her arms crossed and a look impossible to decipher. His mother. She waited for him to approach. For a moment neither of them said anything, then finally she let out a long sigh and tired. You almost killed me with worry. Yes, in Rio Bajido, but I won. She shook her head. It wasn't about winning, Isin. He frowned. His mother touched his face with a deep look. It was about showing the world that they can't walk all over us. And then the weight of the moment fell on him. She wasn't just proud of him for winning the case, she was proud because he had done something much greater than saving himself. He exposed the system, he proved that justice can be manipulated, and he proved that he wouldn't stay quiet. Later that night Isin sat alone looking out at the city skyline. He had won, but he knew there were others like him, boys and girls being wrongfully accused, people being convicted without evidence. The system wasn't broken, it was made to work that way, and Isin knew he couldn't change that alone. But he also knew something else. If that judge thought he should study law, he was right, but Isin didn't want to just study the laws. He wanted to challenge every single one of them and make sure that no one else would have to go through what he went through, because the next time he stepped into a courtroom he would be wearing a suit and he would be on the right side of justice. Now I ask you, how many times has someone been convicted without having the opportunity to defend themselves? How many people don't have the knowledge to fight for themselves? And if that were you or someone you love, the system only changes if we challenge it. Then share this story, leave your like, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because these stories need to be told, and maybe the next battle for justice is closer what you imagine.